Around the year 1800, there are two revolutions happening in Europe, roughly at the same time. The first one is a political revolution, and it can be easily dated because it is the French Revolution, which goes on from 1789 to 1799. And in that revolution, the question is who gets to participate in politics, how should we organize the government, who gets to tax whom, what individual rights do people have, and things like this emerge. The economic revolution is the industrial revolution, which happens in England, where we fundamentally change the way in which we produce goods and in which we generate, the ways in which we generate power. And these two revolutions, which happen roughly in parallel, are fairly disjoint. And Palmer concludes that arguably the Industrial Revolution was more important than the French Revolution or any other change in the social and political history of human societies. And the Industrial Revolution in many ways is still going on. The context of the Industrial Revolution is the return of conservative forces to power in Europe. We have seen that after the French Revolution, Napoleon builds the French Empire until 1815 or so, after his final defeat. And then the Congress of Vienna, a conference of the superpowers of the time, reestablishes the old order. It reshapes the map, but it is setting up a system that very much looks like the systems in place before the French Revolution happened. So we have the monarchy being restored in France. Spain gets a Bourbon monarch again, and things like this. The industrialization will change the power structure, and it will weaken conservative forces. It will do this by empowering a new type of people, namely business people or capital. And the other new type of people that emerge, or the other new class that emerges during the Industrial Revolution, is the wage-earning class, or people that are dependent on selling their labor for a wage. And those two groups will increasingly dominate politics. It will be a long process, but that process will start here. And the power will shift in many ways from monarchies and landed aristocracies that were firmly in control, at least in England, towards business, and then later on also labor. The transitions that the Industrial Revolution brings with it are regarding work. Before 1800 or so, work is mostly done with hand tools, and after it, it's increasingly done by machines. There's a story of rapid automation happening. And second, power is generated differently. Before 1800, it's generated by human or animal muscles, and after, or since then, it is generated from energy found in steam, electricity, to combustion of gases and atoms. So this is the transition that we call the Industrial Revolution. One big puzzle is, why did the Industrial Revolution happen in England? And I want to discuss several factors. First, high mobility. For reasons to be discussed, people became mobile and went to the cities where they were available for hire at very low wages. Secondly, the British Empire has an almost unlimited amount of markets and is very wealthy, so it has a lot of capital for investment. England has resources, including coal and iron. England is population rich, and England is dominated by the ideology of laissez-faire capitalism or classical market liberalism. All of these factors are fertile ground for the Industrial Revolution to take off. One reason for the high mobility of people in England is that they're essentially driven off the farms or cannot live off subsistence farming anymore. And that happens for two reasons. One is they're priced out because agriculture becomes more competitive or more productive. We've seen that during the English Revolution or the English Civil War, that the property owning class, people with lots of land sitting in parliament, were essentially victorious, and their main source of income is farming. And so they're trying to improve the ways in which they farm. And that leads to innovations such as the horseshoe, the seed drill, new types of crops and things like this that will make them more efficient and more productive, raising the competition. A second factor is a series of legislative acts happening mainly between 1715 and 1860, but before and after that too. And those series of acts are called the Enclosure Acts, and they're passed by Parliament. The Enclosure Acts effectively abandoned the open fields or the common land. These were areas that didn't have clear ownership and that could be used by the community. And so those open lands were used by subsistence level farmers to survive. And the Enclosure Acts legislated that those common lands would become private and were privatized, which dispossesses a very large amount of small farmers and peasants, which in the process lose their way of life and livelihood. Some estimates suggest that about 30% of agricultural land of England was privatized through the Enclosure Acts. And this frees up labor, to put it a little bit cynically, because these small farmers that use the open lands can't survive on farming anymore. It also concentrates the land ownership and for those that gain the common lands. And the result is twofold. One is farming gets better. Common land is often difficult to efficiently farm, but if it's privatized, incentives are aligned. And so farmers, these landowners, have strong incentives to increase productivity, but it also increases mobility because these former farmers are driven off their land and they need to find new ways of sustaining themselves, and the cities with the emerging factories give them at least some way of earning money. One reason why England looks the way it looks like, this is a picture today, are these Enclosure Acts. So you see that these fields are literally enclosed. The second factor is the availability of markets and capital. Britain is the most important colonial empire at the time, while France dominates in Europe. England dominates overseas. It has a sheer unlimited size of markets. It has lots and lots of wealth and capital to finance new projects. And Britain has markets to ship their goods, and their major export good is woolen cloth. And it becomes a relatively simple equation to figure out that the more you can weave, the more money you can make. There is no other source of woolen cloth that is competitive. And so shrewd businessmen invent machines for making more money. And they're very good at it. And so they come up with these ways that make that increase productivity by enormous margins. And a couple of these innovations and inventions I want to discuss three actually. One is the flying shuttles, the second one is the spinning jenny, and then later on the steam engine.
This is woolen thread. And this is a frame loom. It's very basic. This is the warp running up and down, and the weft crosses it. So, to weave, you pass the weft up and over each of the warps. It does the job, but it is, as you can see, a very time-consuming and very laborious. And if you're a big strapping Yorkshireman trying to keep your family, it's no good. So, when this came along, weavers could actually make a living out of their craft. This is the hand loom and represents a significant improvement. Same principle. Here's the warp and the weft goes through. But this loom got a piece of kit invented in 1733 by one John Kay that doubled the output of these looms, and it was this. The flying shuttle. Only not very flying. So instead of throwing the shuttle through the warp, you can now just whack it across. And the weavers would keep it in the family. The children carding, the women winding bobbins and spinning, and the men up here weaving. You can see how big the windows were. They'd want as much natural light as possible for these fine yarns. Another thing they used to do to gain as much possible light is to give their walls a lime wash. Lucky there was plenty of it about. The flying shuttle was a major breakthrough. Weavers could now earn a living selling their cloth, transported to market on the canal. The spinning wheel increased spinners' output, but it wasn't until 1764, when Lancastrian James Hargreaves had a brainwave, that spinners could really step up production. His invention was the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny worked on the same principle as the spinning wheel. Here we have the rovings, the unspun cotton, and that's thread on there, and this is how we get it. I pull it back, we pull off the bobbin here, okay? And then we trap it between those two pieces of wood there. So this now is stationary. This spindle at the end is connected to all the other ones, which are connected to this wheel. And as we wind this wheel, it's quite a knack this, but you'll see it comes off the spindle like that, and as it flicks off the top, it's putting a spin into the roving. And because the rest of it's stationary, it's clamped here, and this isn't moving, it's spinning. Okay. And we've now got spun thread between here and there. So this is the complicated bit. What we have to do is go backwards a bit and take that off, and then put the guide wire down like that, and then moving forward quickly the other way, we wind it on. Bingo. Mechanically simple, economically breathtakingly sophisticated, because what happened was that 120 spindle machine, this is a 30 spindle machine, on 4 draws, that's backwards and forwards 4 times, could spin half a mile of cotton. So in the old days, 6 spinners would work to supply 1 weaver. Now, 1 man spinning on this could supply 8 weavers. cash. The journey took cotton out of the home and into the workshops, sounding the death knell for spinning as a cottage industry.
Wood was the primary source for fuel at the time, and was the primary source for building construction and ship construction. And so everybody needed it, and it eventually ran out, and all of Europe experienced wood shortages around the time. This made it economical to dig holes and dig up coal and burn coal instead. And that generated a particular problem, which is that the mines that were dug needed to be pumped out so that they were free of water. And what was needed was a technology to do that pumping. And that technology came in the form of the steam engine. And the steam engine proved to be very useful and very powerful. And a bit after its invention, a few decades after its invention, it was made so small and comparatively efficient that one could put it on a mobile platform, and the train was invented. And so in the time of 1840s in England, you see the emergence of railroads all over the country.
The Salt Revolution programme will contain a section that explores the development of steam power during the 18th and 19th centuries. Two early pioneering engineers of steam were Thomas Newcomen and James Watt. It was steam technology which literally acted as the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. And with that in mind, during the course of this year, I'm going to be visiting a couple of living museums: Beamish near Newcastle and the Black Country near Wolverhampton. At Beamish, I want to obtain some video and photographic reference material of the early steam engines and of the working locomotives which they have there. And at the Black Country Museum, I have my eyes set on the working exhibit of the Newcomen 1712 atmospheric steam engine. I've already created some working CGI models of Newcomen's engine and also of the separate condensing engine built by James Watt in 1776, which I know I'm going to be using within the final production. So why don't we take a brief look? Before the dawn of steam, man harnessed power from his own labours, livestock, and from the elements. But the energy output would always be limited and restrictive. This was the age of reason, of enlightenment, a time when Britain began its unfettered journey towards leading the world in science, technology, trade, commerce, and even empire building. Thomas Newcomen was an English inventor. Born in Dartmouth, Devon in 1664, he became an ironmonger by trade. And in 1712, Newcomen built his first atmospheric steam engine, which was used to pump water from the bottom of mines. The machine was a beam engine that condensed steam to create a vacuum. That in turn allowed the atmospheric air pressure to push down on a piston which was contained within the condensing cylinder, which is about as clear as mud for most people. So let's take a look at this machine in cross section. Here we have the furnace, using coal as fuel to heat up the water inside the boiler. This generates steam, which then enters the condensing cylinder when a valve is opened. The inlet valve is then closed and a jet of cold water is sprayed into the condensing cylinder. This causes the steam to rapidly cool and creates a vacuum. As the external pressure is now greater than that within the cylinder, it pushes the piston down, and the cycle is then repeated. In Newcomen's design, it isn't the steam which forces the piston back up to the top of the condensing cylinder. The beam is actually weighted more on the side of the pump connecting rod, and it's this weighting which pulls the piston back up as the cylinder's pressure is gradually equalized with the external atmospheric pressure. In earlier designs, the valves, or plugs as they were then called, were manually operated by a plugman, but this cyclical action had to be accurate, and it was therefore more preferable to have this operation automated. Now, it may look a little Heath Robinson, but with the introduction of a plug tree connected to the beam action, Newcomen was able to accomplish this task. James Watt was a Scottish inventor born in Greenock in 1736. It was whilst Watt was working as a mechanical engineer and instrument maker at the University of Glasgow that he was asked to repair a working model of Newcomen's steam engine. He came to realise that Newcomen's engine design was less than efficient. With every stroke, energy was being wasted as a condensing cylinder was being repeatedly heated and then cooled. Watt's solution to this problem was to build a steam engine that incorporated a separate condenser. Watt sporadically developed his engine between 1763 and 1775, and as we can already see, there's a little bit more to this than that of Newcomen's engine. So let's take a moment to examine its main features. It's the combined furnace and boiler that produces the steam, which is then transferred through the steam pipe to a series of inlet and exhaust valves, which in turn are connected to the piston cylinder. The piston is connected to the beam, which operates the rotary arm, one end of which is a static cog and that appears to rotate about another cog known as the sun, and it's this sun and planet gears which operate the flywheel. We also have a cold water tank and a hot water tank. In this cross section we can see that Watt's engine is double acting. That's to say end alternately, forcing the piston up or down. This process is controlled by the engine's valve gear, shown here in this cutaway. Active steam alternately enters the valve systems at these points here, whilst the exhaust steam exits the system through these pipes, all of which is controlled by a plug tree rod, which is again linked to the beam. Or steam pipe leading into the cold water tank, in which are housed two cylinders. This is a separate condenser, and the other is a pump which extracts the condensate into the separate hot water tank, which then recirculates back to the boiler. There's still a number of innovative features about these steam engines which I've still not mentioned, but I think we'll come back to those after my visits to the living museums and also within the main Salt Revolution production.
And ever since we're in the fossil fuel age, with a very sharp increase in global fossil carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, caused by burning petroleum, coal, natural gas, and some other factors, and leading to gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Another reason why England is the place where the Industrial Revolution happens is that it has the resources that are necessary, and the two main resources, natural resources, are coal and iron. Coal is relatively easy to access in England, and iron is available. What's also available is capital, as mentioned, and the workers, as also previously mentioned. England also experiences rapid population growth. Not only is it relatively uninvolved in the Napoleonic Wars, which were very costly in terms of population, but we also see rapid growth and urbanization in the areas that have these natural resources. The map shows where you have exposed coal fields that make it easy to access coal, and the industrial areas essentially developed close to these coal and iron areas. And people move to the cities, and the jobs that are generated are or can be filled by women and by children. It's very tedious and oppressive work in many ways. It's often very dangerous. They're very long hours, and it's generally a very difficult time period to be a worker. One of the side effects of the Industrial Revolution is the widespread use of child labor, as you can see here in these depictions. Britain was a favorable place for industrialization, not only because of its ample supplies of coal and iron and its enormous colonial export markets and some of the other factors discussed above, but also because its general political environment and economic environment was one that was fairly free and stable in comparative terms. And it included economic freedom, not least because the dominant ideology was one of market liberalism or laissez-faire economics. This is the time when Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations got published, the idea of the invisible hand organizing magically markets. This is a strong critique of state regulation. The claim is that there are natural laws of production and exchange, and any intervention in these natural laws leads to suboptimal outcomes. Also, this philosophical view of markets sees workers as generally lazy, and if they're being paid too much, they would become even more lazy, and their difficult situation is simply tough luck. They should receive a minimum wage, they should negotiate individually with employers, and so generally there's a negative perception of workers here. So all of these factors come together. The free and stable society, the coal and iron availability, the large export markets, availability of capital, and the enormous amounts of labor freed through a variety of processes. And what emerges is Britain as the workshop of the world with very little competition, at least at the beginning. The industrialization and the Industrial Revolution will spread to other countries, France, Belgium, and then also Germany and Japan and the New World. But at that point, really, it is most underway and most advanced in England. The industrialization brings many social and economic transformations with it. The economic transformations include an expansion of world trade, the introduction of mass production of goods, the factory system. So before the Industrial Revolution, people were spinning at home. Now they are going to factories and are sitting in front of machines. And a whole new system of economic exchange gets established, industrial capitalism. There are some positive effects down the road. We see an increase in standards of living, and there's many negative effects as well, including the relatively new phenomenon of unemployment. The story of the Industrial Revolution really is the story of an astonishing productivity increase, which did lead to enormous accumulation of wealth. If you look at long-term data in terms of GDP per capita, then the data that we have suggests that basically there were ups and downs in the long run. So in the last 2,000, 4,000 years or so, sometimes there was a little higher GDP per capita and a little lower GDP per capita, but it was generally very low. And most humans lived at subsistence levels, which we would put today at about $2 a day or so. And what you see here in the figure is, these are obviously inflation-adjusted numbers, and what you see is starting in around 1800 or so, it really takes off, the GDP per capita for the world, and it is plainly attributable to the Industrial Revolution. That's making it much easier to produce a lot of output with much, much less input. The political changes due to the Industrial Revolution are manifold. One fairly immediate one is that you have the decline of the landed aristocracy in England. This was the part of the elite that was represented in the parliament and that was a powerful player since the English Revolution and before that. Their important historical impact gets replaced now with the emerging class of business people. We see that there will now be demands for participation in the political process, both by capital and by the newly emerging worker class. We see that governments start addressing problems that have been created by industrialization and modernization more generally. So unemployment becomes a big issue, and it becomes a social question, and that will be addressed politically. So governments now increasingly are involved in people's lives. Western Europe becomes hegemonic. It is very soon at its very peak in terms of dominance of the rest of the world. There's lots of imperialism and colonizing going on at this time. We see all around Europe the emergence of nationalistic feelings and the nursing of nationalistic feelings, and all of this will eventually clash in World War I. The Industrial Revolution brings about many social changes. They include social transformations that are very profound, the rapid urbanization in crowded, dirty living quarters for the working class. We see urban slums, high crime rates, sanitation problems. We also see widespread economic insecurity, very low wages, child labor, poverty and destitutions are widespread, and pollution becomes a problem. In the long run, however, there are transformations that are positive. Eventually, most people share, though to a varying degree, in the increasing wealth. The working and living conditions will be improved. We see an increase in wages. We see an increase in leisure time. We see generally an increase in the population and an improved status and earning power of women. We also see that science and research are taking off during this time. One reaction to the economic problems and the social questions that the Industrial Revolution raises will be government intervention, which is still with us. But perhaps the most profound change is a change or the emergence of a new socioeconomic class or socioeconomic classes with, on the one hand, the working class, those people that work by selling their labor and depend on wage income, and then the wealthy industrial or capital class. And that cleavage, those different interests that the working class or labor on the one hand and the industrial class or capital or employers on the other hand have, is still a defining feature for rich democracies or capitalist industrial countries more generally, that shapes politics in many ways.